Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another virtual visit with the Frye Art Museum. My name is Negarra Kudumu. I am the manager of public programs at the Frye Art Museum, and it is my very great pleasure today to welcome Kemi Adeyemi, writer and academic at the University of Washington in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality. Kemi, thank you so much for being here. And I'm just wondering if you could start us out by telling us a little bit about your practice.
So I'm in the Gender, Women, Sexuality Studies department here at UW, and I think my practice of late, especially in this past quarter, has really been teaching focused. I was fortunate enough to have some fellowships through the fall and the winter that allowed me to kind of do my own work, which I'll talk about in a second, but I was able to focus this past quarter just on teaching. And so I feel like for me, my practice is really very much, I have to kind of segment my work in order to make space for teaching in a way, because it requires such a particular energy flow that is very different from when I'm able to just be researching and writing my own work, which is very insular and I'm just kind of in my head and alone a lot. And so it was nice this past quarter, even though we were online, we were just doing classes like on Zoom and discussion boards. It was really nice to kind of be outward facing a little bit. Like I was sort of saying, primarily my work, I guess, is as a researcher and as a writer. I've been working on and finishing my book, which is an ethnography of Black, queer, and lesbian women in Chicago. It's an ethnography of their social dance spaces. And so a kind of very general question is, when do Black queer women dance? Where do they go? Why do they dance? What decisions do they make on and on the dance floor? And how do their dance practices and their practices of talking about dance articulate their relationships to Black queer sexuality, and also articulate their relationships to the city of Chicago, which is, very violently displaced, marginalized, segregated, limited Black people's movements and Black queer people, their movements in particular. And so the book is moving through several different social dance spaces that are kind of in flux and facing different pressures, from the bar management to the city's zoning laws, to conflicts between dancers and organizers, and just sort of thinking about the politics of taking place through dance and how that can tell us a story about how people live in cities that are governed by neoliberal rules, regulations, modes of comportment that are really antagonistic toward Black queer life. Antagonistic toward Black queer life, but profit off of particular, ways of being. Sort of drag race version of Black queer life is very different from the kinds of Black queer life that are being staged, at a monthly party at a neighborhood bar. So that's the project that's been at the forefront of my mind right now. And I'm, waiting on reviewers, getting revisions on that book, hopefully any day now. And, I was able to finish up some smaller writing projects over the last year that have been, recently published in some journals, some academic journals. Yeah.
Wonderful. A part of your practice, and probably at least one of the things that people know you best for here in Seattle, is the Black Embodiment Studio. So I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I obviously forgot it. I started the Black Embodiment Studio 3 years ago, I guess. And it's a hybrid arts writing incubator and public lecture series that is focused on developing arts critical discourse about contemporary Black artists, and specifically contemporary Black artists who have a kind of an explicit relationship with writing, whether that's because they incorporate writing into their visual art practice, for example, or that's because writing is a big part of their own kind of research process, as they are conceiving new works. And also, so bringing in Black artists who think with writing, and also bringing in curators writers to give quarterly public lectures about their practice. The sort of main focus of the Black Embodiment Studio is to train graduate students in writing arts criticism. And there's kind of a couple of goals of that. One is to diversify graduate training. You know, we are really trained to write to our discipline. So if you're trained in English, you're trained to write to people in English, and it's a kind of closed loop. And so we have all of these graduate students at the University of Washington and other places of higher education who have immense research skills, critical thinking skills, and they need opportunities to develop more flexible voices. And thinking with art does that. And so it's to kind of create some more conversation between the kind of formal art sphere and formal academic sphere. And then also, by doing so, ideally produce new arts writers of color who are, you know, capable of writing about artists of color and Black artists in particular. Right. Capable of bringing their kind of research practice to bear on visual art, movement arts, and ideally get paid for it. You know, the problem being that we've been totally defunded as far as arts writing goes, but the goal of BES is basically to foster a kind of discourse machine that benefits new writers and artists, and, you know, the kind of arts ecosystem of Seattle in the process.
Awesome. That's really amazing and much needed, particularly for the points that you made around the lack of opportunity for arts writing, not just in Seattle, but just sort of period in the United States, the way in which arts sections of major newspapers have been completely and totally just removed, the way in which, you know, independent bloggers have just really not been able to, you know, make a living really just doing exclusively arts writing. So I'm really happy to hear that as the central tenet of the Black Embodiment Studio. In addition, obviously, to the very necessary focus, particularly in a place like Seattle with its demographic, of focusing on exclusively Black artists, be they, you know, African continent based or of the diaspora. Just that focus is much needed here. So very appreciative of your work in that area. Given,
I should say really quick, that each year the Black Embodiment Studio puts out a journal that compiles writing of people who were participating. And so each year we do sort of end up with a catalog of the Black art that was staged in Seattle the previous year, because there's actually a lot of Black art that is staged here. It's kind of confused, you know, you have to know where to look. And so the Black Embodiment Studio website has a calendar that literally catalogs all of the Black art that's on view. And so the calendar plus the journal is also to kind of say, hey, there is Black art that happens in this city, and there is conversation that's happening around it.
That's really amazing. And we're definitely going to make sure that our audience has all those links so they can follow the work of the Black Embodiment Studio, as well as your work as well. Just sort of building off of that point, in your conversations with artists that you would want to invite, hopefully when we are able to do so, you know, sort of their insights sort of also merged with what you're observing is the real-time impact of this pandemic on the art world, but even art making, art thinking, art writing. What are you hearing and what are you seeing and feeling around those observations and those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think two main things. One, anxieties about whether institutions that artists were already working with are going to continue to pay them for projects that are either being canceled or delayed. So artists are depending upon exhibitions, for example, amongst other things, amongst other opportunities. They're kind of factoring that into their budget, and then a pandemic hits and an institution will stop payment, you know, and it's sort of like, well, what is the ethical contract then between an institution and an artist? And so that's, I think, one side of the conversation that I've been hearing and seeing and engaging in. And I think the other side of the conversation actually has a lot to do with the former, which is artists saying, you know what, I'm not going to do any work right now. I'm not gonna do live chats. I'm not gonna, send out email blasts. I'm not gonna take the time to like really dig into my work because I have free time now.
Mm-hmm.
Just artists really putting a pause for both personal reasons, like let me rest, and also reasons that have to do with the kinds of labor that institutions depend on from artists and demand from artists, often without pay. And so I think that those 2 points of not wanting to be the new public face of an institution and wanting to rest are like the primary conversations that I'm seeing be staged.
Yeah, no, that seems to, so far in the conversations I'm having as well, seems to be sort of a theme, like either almost a full stop or just, we'll see what comes next. Speaking of what could potentially come next, and it's interesting because when I first was thinking about the series, one of my questions was phrased around a post-pandemic reality, but at this point, we don't know if there's going to be a post-pandemic reality anytime soon. And so from your perspective as an academic, but also as someone who is a convener and a facilitator for contemporary Black art, sort of from all angles, the discursive level, the scholarly level, and then the actual level of the maker, the artistic level, what, to the extent that you feel like you can be predictive, what do you think, or perhaps better, more precisely, how are the ways in which our art world, what are the ways in which our art world are going to have to change in order to continue on, but also be more mindful of the ways in which our previous modes of working were, problematic, whether problematic means inequitable, whether problematic means not environmentally sustainable. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the first thing that comes to mind in terms of like what would need to change, pandemic or not, is more transparency about money, how institutions get their money and how they distribute their money. And I think that's because I think that opacity around how institutions specifically support artists, whether that be in terms of stipends or production support, installation support, the literal financial material that will help an artist produce a work. I think there needs to be a lot more transparency about that. Because, the art world, like kind of any institutional world, it traffics in secrecy in order to save money. And so people who know how to ask the right kinds of questions and people who are comfortable with and trained in demanding resources get those resources. And people who don't get them. And so I think a huge thing is transparency about that. And I mean transparency at the level of when an institution emails an artist an invitation to do anything, it should be right there. We have this much money. We can or we cannot negotiate. Or we have this much money and we are going to do work to try to get you more money. Just like whatever. That paragraph is so, so important. And it creates trust. I think it creates clarity, of course, but it also creates trust between the institution and whomever they're kind of trying to contract, because we're really talking about contract relationships here.
Right.
So I think that that's a huge part. We're of course facing the kind of endless ongoing conversation about equity in museum space. And that's a complicated one. Like there's no one clean, clear answer. Hiring more people of color into an institution is a great plan. Is the institution going to support those people once they're in the institution? That's an entirely different conversation. It shouldn't be a different conversation, but typically, the first and only thing the institution will do is hire a Black person to be the chief diversity officer. This happens at academic institutions too, and then stonewalls them. Every single decision is delayed and made impossible. And so the thing that needs to happen then is kind of multi-step plans of support for the people that institutions claim to want to have in their space. And that gulf between the claim of we want you in the space and we will do whatever it takes to keep you here is massive, right? And so that is so institution specific. That's a really long, tedious process for an institution to come to terms with whether or not they really do want that to happen in their space, or whether they just need to do it so that they can keep their board intact.
Right. Yeah, no, it's definitely a long game. And I think what we're seeing now, or hopefully what we will be clear on sooner than later, is which institutions are interested in that long game and which just simply are not.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a lot of that, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, before we wrap up, if you could share with us sort of what's coming up for you next. Clearly, we're on summer break, and again, we're hoping that there will be an ability to return to a fall season, which means a return to teaching, a return to museums being open. And so with that in mind, what's coming up next for you? Potential plans for Black Embodiments Studio? What's next on your to-do list?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely planning out how to kind of teach and be online this fall. So for my own personal classes that I have to teach, but also with the Black Embodiment Studio, how to engage people or give opportunities for people to feel engaged in ways that feel generative and not draining. And so that means what's the least amount of work the Black Embodiment Studio can do to provide people in the city points of access to stimulate conversation. And so I'm definitely taking the summer and like talking to people and strategizing, like what kinds of content do people want? What kinds of resources might students need to like engage with art when they can't go to a physical space? And so that's absolutely, that's a long term, this isn't going to be just this one quarter. So thinking about the longevity of BES online is definitely the next step.
For sure. And how can we follow your work and the work of the Black Embodiment Studio?
For the Black Embodiment Studio, just go to our website, blackembodiments.org. There's a little sign up to get the very, very, very infrequently sent newsletter. So we're not going to inundate you. That's everything BES is just on the website. For me personally, I would say check out my own personal website or my faculty website at UW. So I'm pretty easy to find online, kemiadeyemi.com, and my writing is up there, articles that I've published are up there, bio, all of that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Kemi, thank you so much for joining us for this virtual visit. Thank you, our audience, for following what the Frye does, and we will be back very shortly with another. Again, thank you so much, Kemi, and thank you guys.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.